your finger twisted. Don't inquire about Bernadette then. Brian is often questioned about what became of Bernadette. Despite being the last person to see her before she vanished, Brian remains silent. Everyone in the village adored Bernadette, who was a kind, elderly lady. The court footage from the night she vanished showed Brian acting alone, leaving her home and doing a small, slow dance in her front yard. Brian bowed his fingers painfully back as a guy asked him to inform him where Bernadette was. At that point, Brian began dancing slowly and whirling by himself. Then, after being accosted aggressively by a lady who wanted to know where Bernadette was, all Brian could reply was that he couldn't tell her. The lady was yelling and cursing at him because she couldn't stand it, but Brian held his ground and accepted all of the yelling and accusations. When the lady answered that she didn't give a crap, Brian began to choke up and all he could say was, "I cannot say where she is." In response, the woman bent one of her fingers back. Then, before the troops were sent out to fight, Brian began gently dancing on his own, much as they did in dance halls during World War II. After a while, the police managed to apprehend Brian, and everyone was happy that they had him. There was another prisoner in the same cell as Brian. The prisoner expressed curiosity regarding Bernadette's absence, but Brian would only admit that he was unable to provide anything. Brian continued to ignore the other prisoner, who was becoming aroused and wanted to know what had happened to her. The other prisoner then informed Brian that because he was the last to see her and had entered her home, everyone believed he had done something to her. Then, in response to his fellow prisoner, Brian bent his fingers back and began to dance on his own. After the other prisoner let out a scream, Brian was moved to a different cell. Throughout their interrogation, the detective insisted that Brian tell him about Bernadette. The investigator became louder and more insisted that Brian tell him, to which Brian continued responding that he couldn't. Then Brian took the detective's hands and twisted one finger back. The investigator spotted Brian dancing slowly on his own while sobbing in agony. With agony, the detective said, "Where is Bernadette?" Brian said, "Where are you pointing with your bent finger?" The detective's bowed finger pointed to the ceiling, where he saw Bernadette floating with occulting and ceremonial artifacts and marks on her nude, floating body, along with an evil embrace and a terrifying grin. "She enjoys dancing, so I danced to divert her attention." Brian instructed the detective to go out instantly.